So I am beyond delighted, also honored to be introducing our speaker today. So on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, a talk entitled, Abba has begun to make money from the beer business and Halakhah in Rabbinic literature. Presented today by Professor Jordan D. Rosenblum of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this event is part of the Bible and the Ancient World seminar series and is co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures and the UCLA Center for the Study of Religion. Before getting to the specifics of the talk and Professor Rosenblum, I'd like to thank everyone for staying socially distant, and we ask that you please silence your phones at this time. So please do that. I've already done it myself. Today's speaker, Jordan D. Rosenblum, is the Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism and the Max and Frida Weinstein Bascom Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on the law, literature, and social history of the rabbinic movement in general and in particular on rabbinic food regulations. Food and drink regulations, maybe you know. He is the author of many books. I should have brought them to show you today. He is the author of Rabbinic Drinking, What Beverages Teach Us About Rabbinic Literature, published with the University of California Press in 2020. The Jewish Dietary Laws in the Ancient World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. And Food and Identity in Early Rabbinic Literature, also by Cambridge in 2010. He has co-edited a number of volumes, including Feasting and Fasting, The History of Ethics of Jewish Food, published by NYU Press, and Animals and the Law in Antiquity. He is currently working on a new book project, which I'm very excited about, provisionally titled Jews and the Pig, A History. And I believe it's just signed a contract with... entitled, with NYU Press for this book, which will explore the long history of the association between Jewish communities and the pig. I'm delighted to have him here because he's actually my doctoral advisor. He's a great teacher and a great reader of ancient texts and an even better person. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rosenblum for his talk today on drinking in rabbinic literature.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. So I want to thank the Leve Center. This is an amazing opportunity. I want to thank Chelsea for handling all the logistics, and Professor Bonesho, my former student, my star pupil. It's great to be out here. This is also a wonderful moment because I actually wrote a draft of this talk summer 2019. Planning to give it at a conference in May 2020, but as you can imagine, that conference didn't happen, and it now hopefully is going to happen in June. So I've been working on this for several years, but this is my first time actually trying it out in front of someone other than me speaking to myself in my basement alone. So hopefully it makes sense. A famous dictum in Mishnah Avot 5:17 declares, "Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven shall not endure." Which dispute is for the sake of heaven? The dispute between Hillel and Shammai. And which one is not for the sake of heaven? The dispute between Korach and all of his congregation. When the ancient houses of Hillel and Shammai, renowned for vigorously debating each other, argued, their ultimate goal was to adjudicate and nuance rabbinic law, or in Hebrew, Halakhah. However, when the biblical figure Korach led a rebellion against Moses, this act of aggression was not deemed justified on pious and worthy principles. What this dictum comes to represent, then, is that while legal debate is at the center of the rabbinic enterprise, the goal of this legal debate must be to work towards expanding and better articulating Halakhah. The debate that detracts from this pious goal goes against divine will, and thus, in the end, shall not endure. While there is much scholarship on the contours of rabbinic dispute that is for the sake of heaven, my talk today is a preliminary exploration of instances where legal debates for the sake of heaven conceal potential financial interest. In particular, I focus on test cases about the Halakhah of beer, where certain authorities directly involved in the beer industry argue for change in rabbinic law related to beer, with the result that the beer business potentially benefits from their halachic rulings. What does this have to do with the religious concept of lived religion? In general, when scholars speak about lived religion as a category, they're attempting to include and analyze the lives of ordinary people and the context of ordinary, mundane life, rather than just texts that focus on elite religious experts and the context of elaborate ritual practice. In my talk today, I argue that in a handful of passages in the Babylonian Talmud, which Professor Bonesho's students, if they were in a class today, learned a little bit about, featuring rabbinic brewers, elite male rabbinic authorities with a financial stake in the beer industry either change rabbinic law to include beer or rule leniently regarding beer. Such conversations provide an interesting lens through which to view lived religion in rabbinic communities in late antiquity. Throughout this talk, beer functions as a test case for discussing interactions between rabbinic authority, religious tradition, regional variance, innovation, and financial gain. The case of beer suggests the need for a more complex model, wherein ancient rabbinic figures are not just disinterested authorities, but embodied humans who can take both religion seriously and have serious beer interests. They work to harmonize disharmony, which points to the messy realities of lived religion. Taken together, these examples offer insight into how the religion of brewing leads to brewing of religion. What emerges from this test case, then, is a more nuanced model of ancient rabbinic world that is not an either or, but a both and. Okay, beer and ritual recitation is the first. So as a wine-drinking region, texts that originate in Roman Palestine consider wine the quintessential beverage for ritual purposes. In fact, Mishnah Brachot 6.1, the classic text for rabbinic food blessings, explicitly offers a separate blessing for wine. How does one recite the blessing over fruit? For fruit of the tree, one says, creator of the fruit of the tree, except for wine. For upon wine, one says, creator of the fruit of the vine. Rabbinic rituals are therefore wine-based rituals. The status quo is only questioned in the Babylonian Talmud, which is crafted in a beer-drinking region of Babylonia. As a scholar who lives in Wisconsin, the land of beer and cheese, I can appreciate the importance of reminding people that beer is deserving of recognition. And I think my state would be proud of me for quoting that. As a state employee, I think I'm legally obligated to do that. Authorities cited in the Babylonian Talmud question for the first time whether wine is the only alcoholic beverage suitable for ritual purposes. One domain in which this is debated plays out in rituals related to that bookend the Sabbath, Kiddush and Havdalah. Both rituals involve blessings over wine as part of a brief liturgy that marks respectively the beginning and the end of Sabbath. So Kiddush is the beginning, Havdalah is the end. But must wine be the beverage centered for these rituals? This is a question that only makes sense in a beer-drinking culture, and the Babylonian Talmud was crafted in just such an environment. Rather than quote the entirety of the text, I summarize the main points it makes. We begin with an anecdote. A sage visits two friends on a Saturday afternoon. As the sun sets, it's time for Havdalah, the ritual that separates, in the words of the ritual itself, between holy and profane, between light and darkness, between the seventh day and the 6 days of labor. As with other rabbinic rituals, the expected beverage for blessing is wine. But the sage's friends have no wine. They are beer drinkers. They recite their blessings and perform the Havdalah ritual. Their visiting friend, however, does not complete the ritual until the next day, when they procure wine for him. The next year, their friend once again visits on a Saturday afternoon. This time, their friend realizes that beer is the wine of this region. He recites Havdalah using beer instead of wine. Next, the text investigates whether beer may replace wine for the purpose of completing Kiddush and Havdalah rituals. Quickly, it concludes that beer cannot be used for Kiddush for technical reasons we don't need to get into, but evidence is offered in support of using beer as Havdalah. Unfortunately for the beer business, that leniency is soon walked back as other authorities reject that assertion. For example, one sage who tasted a particularly flavorful beer declared that beer like this is suitable to recite Kiddush over it. He then experienced intestinal distress that night, and as a result, he reconsidered his previous statement. So he said it's wonderful, then he had some tummy problems and walked it back. In the famous words of John Bon Jovi on the slide, sometimes you tell the day by the bottle that you drink. And for the rabbis, you can tell it's the Sabbath because you're not drinking from a beer bottle. After some back and forth, we're told another story, which provides the title for today's talk. Rav Huna found Rav reciting Kiddush over beer. Rav Huna said to him, Abba has begun to make money from the beer business. Later commentators smooth out the potential rough edges of Rav Huna's statements. The famous French medieval rabbinic authority and reputed winemaker, Rashi, for example, states that Rav's business led him to develop a taste and preference for beer. But polemics aside, there is nothing explicit in this text to support this reading. On the contrary, the more straightforward reading would be that Rav Huna found Rav reciting Kiddush over beer and surprised, given everything that we've already learned. Why would Rav, whom he addresses with the Aramaic honorific Abba, meaning father or more literally daddy, do such a thing? Because Rav is now in the beer business. In the most generous reading of this text, piety and profit intersect. In the less than generous reading, profit bends piety to its will. Whether Rav Huna merely shook his head and laughed, or even uttered the words with indignation or venom, we do not know. The text moves on from there to other related laws. If this were the only such text, there wouldn't be much to build an argument on. But as luck would have it, there are a few other instances where piety and profit intersects regarding beer. As we venture forward in our exploration of this topic, we will continue to ask ourselves, what does this teach us about lived religion amongst the Babylonian rabbinic community in late antiquity? For now, we do not have enough to say, but a complex picture where one can appeal both to revelation and to return on investment is beginning to emerge. It is now time to introduce a key figure in our study, Rav Papa. And someone made a beer dedicated. I love it when you call me Rav Papa, which is a joke on many levels. And if I have to explain it, it's not going to be funny. This is what I'm told. It's not funny when I explain jokes, but I'm happy to explain them. So Rav Papa is a 4th century Babylonian rabbinic authority. He appears often in the Babylonian Talmud, wherein he offers his opinion on a variety of halachic debates. Across these many mentions, a few general observations can be made. Although he gained a decent level of authority, he was neither always respected by his students, nor was he the most likable of rabbinic figures. Despite this, his rulings are usually found to be the final ones quoted in a redacted text, which usually means that they're considered the most authoritative. In the Talmud, as in life, the one who gets in the last word is often the one whose view is most heard. His statements often reconcile differing opinions, and also worthy of note is that on multiple occasions, Rav Papa is described as being quite corpulent. Normally, I would avoid commentary on anyone's body, whether the embodied humans are ancient or modern, but Rav Papa's girth is actually part of our story. Why does it matter that Rav Papa is fat? Because we are told of his enormous wealth. In the parlance of our time, he is a fat cat. In the ancient world, as in the modern world, wealth bestows privilege, including reliable access to sufficient and, in fact, an overabundance of food and drink. And all this matters to us because of the source of his wealth. In his own words, Rav Papa said, "Had I not brewed beer, I would not have become rich." Rav Papa is a beer baron. The beer business has made him wealthy. Both his physical size and the size of his bank account are due to beer. This all bears repeating because Rav Papa has occasion to refer to beer in rabbinic law. When he does so, we cannot ignore the clear financial stake that he has in any such halachic decision. Piety and profit are both at play. In order to prove this point, I'm going to focus on 3 Talmudic texts, one wherein Rav Papa's profit is explicit, and 2 where his profit is concealed. In each instance, Rav Papa takes a halachic stance that affects his financial bottom line. The first text appears during a discussion of rabbinic business law. The matter at hand is a financial transaction known in Aramaic as a tarsha. Concisely defined, tarsha refers to, in the words of Michael Sokoloff, a type of futures transaction which may lead to usurious payments. Without getting too into the technical details here, Jews are forbidden from charging usurious interest to other Jews. A futures contract that allows a Jew to provide goods to a Jewish customer now, but includes the requirement that the Jewish customer must pay for the goods later at a significantly higher rate, would, at first blush, appear to be about as kosher as pork futures would be. That is, not kosher at all. And I have a footnote that lets you know that pork futures are not kosher. But you can't read the footnote, so I've read it into the record. As with most things in rabbinic law, the answer is not quite as clear. There are ways to structure a tarsha to comply with rabbinic law. While I am no Michael Lewis, the writer of popular books on economics and culture, I will do my best to explain just a bit more about this rabbinic futures contract. The Aramaic term tarsha literally refers to deafness. In a form of ableism, it presumes that the futures contract is unable to hear the usury. The fact that the deferred price is higher than the current market price rates does not then constitute usury because no one said, or importantly heard, the word usury, right? If you don't use the word usury, it's not usury. Like the mortgage crisis of 2008, the fact that something that seems like robbery is technically legal is simultaneously both astounding and unsurprising. Our favorite corpulent beer baron regularly employs one such tarsha. As we learned, Rav Papa said, "My tarsha is permitted. What is the reason? My beer does not spoil, and I do not need the money. It is I who am doing a favor for the buyer." Rav Sheshet, son of Rav Idi, said to Rav Papa, "What does the master see to follow yourself? Why not go after them? If they had money, they would buy the beer at current price. But now that they have no money, they buy beer at the expensive price of the future." The text opens by Rav Papa boldly stating that his futures transaction is permitted insofar as it does not violate biblical and rabbinic laws regarding usury. While he does not explain how precisely he structures his business deals, the basic logic seems discernible from his subsequent comments. Rav Papa sells his beer now when it's priced low, but at the price that he expects it to command in the future when beer prices are presumed to rise. He believes that this is not usury for two reasons. First, unlike ancient wine, ancient beer was more shelf-stable. It could be made year-round, while wine production was tied to the agricultural cycle of the grape harvest, and could last longer than wine, which easily can turn into vinegar. Thus, Rav Papa was in no rush to sell his product. Second, he could literally afford to wait. Rav Papa's bank account balance was such that he didn't need to sell the beer now. He could wait until the market price of beer rose, both because his product could keep and because he could cover all of his bills until then. This is a perfect case of the modern adage, "It takes money to make money." A poorer brewer would need to sell immediately in order to cover their overhead and buy more product. But a wealthy brewer, like Rav Papa, could afford to wait and sell their product until market demands would net the highest price. Rather than being a potential instance of usury, therefore, Rav Papa believed that it was he who was doing the buyer a favor by selling them beer today at tomorrow's price. The buyer is imagined as J. Willington Wimpy, the character commonly known as Wimpy from the classic comic strip Popeye, who would famously declare, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." Rav Papa imagines himself as doing a service to his customer who are willing to overpay Tuesday for a beer today. While this might technically be kosher, it still stinks. This is the point raised by Rav Sheshet, son of Rav Idi, when he asked Rav Papa on what basis he follows his own opinion, claiming that Rav Papa, referred to here by the perhaps passively aggressive honorific master, is earning no interest and hence not practicing usury because he could afford to wait. He says that's a self-serving interpretation, even if it's factually correct. Rav Sheshet asked Rav Papa why he failed to consider the perspective of the buyer, the very ones who he claims to be doing a favor. After all, if they had the cash in hand Today, they would buy Rav Papa's beer today. The fact that they need to pay Tuesday for today's beer indicates that they are not in the same financial position of Rav Papa, who, by his own admission, has no need for their money today. While this tarsha is not technically usury, that does not mean that Rav Papa is the humanitarian he presents himself as being here. What does this first text then teach us about lived religion? Note that Rav Sheshet calls out Rav Papa for his hypocrisy. Of course you permit this tarsha, Rav Sheshet implies, because from your own fat cat perspective, you will get paid the same money no matter what. And by deferring payment, you can present yourself as practicing noblesse oblige. But if you take a moment to think from your customer's perspective, you would realize that the whole reason that they need the tarsha is because they lack your resources. If you were really doing them a favor, you would at the very least let them pay Tuesday for beer at today's rate. But Rav Papa has justified his business practice as not constituting usury and claimed that it really is doing a favor for his customers, when in reality, the halachic ruling benefits his own financial bottom line. When Rav Papa declares, "My tarsha is permitted," his words affect both the halachic and his own financial bottom line. If we only consider rabbinic figures as disinterested pious actors, then we fail to account for the instances where they are also humans with profit motives. Conversely, if we only consider them to be humans with profit motives, then we fail to account for the fact that Rav Papa assures that his business practices conform to rabbinic law and claims a moral basis for this action. Rav Papa both cares about Halakhah and bends it to his will. We continue to think through this complexity in our second text, wherein Rav Papa makes a subtler halachic move, which conceals his financial benefit. I present this text first and then give the background necessary to understand Rav Papa's halachic actions and how they are good for his business. It was stated, why did they prohibit the beer of idolaters? Rami Bar Chama said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, because of intermarriage. For Rav Papa, they would bring the beer out of the door of the non-Jew's tavern and he would drink it there. For Rav Achai, they would bring it to his house and he would drink it there. Both of them agreed that the prohibition existed in order to prevent intermarriage, but Rav Achai made a greater buffer. The text opens with a question. Why was the beer of idolaters prohibited? Before we get to that question, we need to take a detour first about why the wine of idolaters was prohibited. The wine of idolaters was prohibited because the rabbis believed that their contemporaneous non-Jews were idol worshippers who possessed an insatiable urge to pour out wine as ritual libation to their many deities. And since Rabbinic Judaism considers idol worship to be the polar opposite of monotheistic worship, the rabbis devote significant attention to avoiding idolatrous practice. By the way, if you want to know more about this, you should speak to Professor Bonesho, because her work touches on a lot of this. Always sticking in a plug. Wine is often used to symbolize these forbidden practices and the ways to avoid them. In fact, the tractate of the Mishnah and the Talmud that centers on the topic of idolatry, in Hebrew avodah zarah, which literally means foreign worship, that tractate closes with an extended discussion of social relations with idolaters during the production, storage, and consumption of wine. Yet, we must note that wine is neither completely banned, that wine in general is neither completely banned, nor is drinking wine with non-Jews. However, the entire process, from the beginning of production to the transport, storage, and eventual consumption of wine, is heavily regulated. At the core of these regulations is the central belief that non-Jews are, in the words of Sasha Stern, compulsive libationers, who cannot resist the urge to pour wine to their deities. And since once wine is libated, it is classified as libated wine, or in Hebrew, yain nesach, with an associated series of complicated prohibitions, then this means that any interaction between Jews and non-Jews that involves wine, even if the wine was produced by Jews, must be heavily monitored. While the wine of, or wine left alone with, non-Jews is suspect because of concern for libation, what about non-wine intoxicants? Since the rabbis are aware that wine was the only beverage libated by idolaters, does the same stigma apply to other beverages that, while still alcoholic, are not subject to idolatrous libation? This question is especially important for the rabbinic community that resides in Babylonia, where we've discussed beer is their beverage, not wine. So we're now ready to turn to the text at hand. Sorry, it's a long aside to get us there, but that's the way the rabbis and my brain work. By the rabbi's own admissions, non-wine intoxicants are not libated by idolaters. Beer can never be libated wine. It can never be yein nesech. Why then, our text asks, do the rabbis express concerns about the beer of idolaters? Because the rabbis are aware that drinking together can lead to romance. That is, that social intercourse is the first step down the slippery slope that can lead to sexual intercourse. Therefore, the beer of idolaters is prohibited because of intermarriage. The non-wine alcohol of an idolater is not subject to the libation prohibition. It is not yein nesech and therefore cannot be banned in and of itself. Instead, it is the social situation and not the beer that is deemed not kosher. Thus, two rabbis order non-Jewish beer from a non-Jew's tavern, but drink it off premises. Rav Papa would drink non-Jewish beer right outside of the non-Jewish bar. Rav Achai, on the other hand, was more stringent. He would wait to drink non-Jewish beer until he was within the confines of his own home. Both rabbis agree that the beer itself is kosher, but the social situation is not. They simply disagree about how much physical distance one must place between themselves and the non-Jewish bar. A critical fact already known to us is omitted in this text. The first rabbi who demonstrates this beer-related leniency is none other than our corpulent beer baron, Rav Papa. Based on what we've already learned, two details should not surprise us. First, Rav Papa is the first to step up to the plate, or perhaps we should say the keg, and endorse a practice that is both in accordance with Halakhah and beneficial to the beer industry. And second, of the two cited beer-related opinions, Rav Papa endorses the least strict interpretation. After all, the lower the bar, the better for the one who profits from the bar. Once again, Rav Papa stands at the intersection of piety and profit. The fact that he profits from his piety should neither be over nor understated. This is the messy reality of lived religion. Here, the fact that another rabbi shares his general opinion about the permissibility of drinking the beer of idolaters off-premise suggests that Rav Papa's profit motives do not completely overshadow his piety. But then again, we cannot ignore the fact that he opts for the most lenient interpretation. By refusing to enter the idolater's tavern when drinking their beer, Rav Papa assuages the concern that interreligious social intercourse could lead to interreligious sexual intercourse. But by imbibing their beer at the first possible instant, just outside the tavern's door, Rav Papa's embodied practice tacitly supports the lowest possible barrier for the beer industry. He simultaneously complies with the law and actively sets the legal standards as minimally as possible, which is to his own financial benefit. Our third example and final example is another example of the concealment of Rav Papa's beer-related profit motives. Amidst a discussion of halachic advice aimed mainly at best practices for young male Torah scholars, the following appears. Rav Papa said, and Rav Chisda said, I have Papa on the brain. And Rav Chisda said, one who is able to eat barley bread but instead eats wheat bread transgresses on account of you shall not destroy. And Rav Papa said, one who is able to drink beer but instead drinks wine transgresses on account of you shall not destroy. But that is not correct. The prohibition of you shall not destroy with respect to the body is preferable. The biblical verse cited above, and you've all memorized the Bible, so I'm sorry to tell you this, but just in case someone hasn't. The biblical verse cited above prohibits those besieging a city to chop down fruit trees, because, for quote, you may eat from them, end quote. The rabbis developed this into a broader prohibition of not being wasteful. Building on this, Rav Chisda advises his poor students to not waste their money buying more expensive food, i.e. wheat bread, when cheaper food options, i.e. barley bread, are available. By the way, to my knowledge, Rav Chisda has no financial interest in either the grain or the bread business, and therefore I don't see any profit motives behind this assertion. Next, Rav Papa chimes in, suggesting that one who drinks wine when beer is available is similarly wasteful. By now, we should be suspicious of this. Of course, Rav Papa thinks it would be wasteful to drink wine. It would be wasteful for his profit margin. Piggybacking on Rav Chisda's advice that poor students should not buy nice bread when cheaper bread is available, Rav Papa informs students that if they drink the more expensive alcoholic beverage of wine when cheap beer is available, then they are violating a biblical prohibition of waste. They are wasting their money. And the text never reveals his potential profit motive. It does seem, at the very least, somewhat disingenuous for a fat cat rabbinic beer baron to make this claim. And lest you think I am just a modern heretic for making this observation, I should point out that at least one well-regarded medieval rabbinic commentator, the Maharsha, noted this conflict of interest in a text written in the 16th century. But these are some of the things you notice that commentators will either ignore it or they'll kind of make a comment on the slide and no one wants to talk about it, except me now. So, this potential conflict of interest might be behind the next statement, wherein the anonymous redactor of the Babylonian Talmud puts its thumb on the scale. Both Rav Chizda's statement and Rav Papa's are not correct. The anonymous and authoritative voice of the Babylonian Talmud asserts, "It is not wasteful to feed your body healthy foods. Therefore, one does not violate the rabbinic principle, you shall not destroy, when they purchase healthy but more expensive food." This statement can be read two ways. Perhaps it simply clarifies that Rav Chizda and Rav Papa did not fully understand that it is not wasteful to eat better quality food, even when they're ingesting the food, even when the one ingesting the food is a poor student. Or, if there is a more sarcastic bite to this comment, it especially responds to Rav Papa. In that case, it could be a double rebuke. Not only does it reject a halachic move by Rav Papa to pad his own bottom line, but it also tacitly suggests that wine is healthier than beer, which is also bad for Rav Papa's business. Regardless of its intentions, the function of this final remark blunts the potential financial advantage that Rav Papa's statement provides to his beer business. Models of lived religion must take into consideration the messy realities of lived religion. In this talk, beer serves as what I hope is a fascinating test case for the intersection of piety and profit. Often the brewer at the center of the action is Rav Papa, but he is not the only rabbinic authority whose halachic decisions regarding beer are potentially influenced by financial stakes in the beer industry. At these moments, their beer brewing rabbinic authorities attempt to feign disinterest despite a clear conflict of interest. A figure such as Rav Papa does not make sense if we divide the world solely into pious rabbis and impious business people. Perhaps such a divide is influenced by the famous claim in the New Testament, according to Matthew 6:24, "You cannot serve God and mammon." Whether one can indeed serve both their deity and their wealth, mammon, is not up for me to decide. However, I hope that I have proven in today's talk that some took both seriously and did not see their devotion to piety to preclude their making a profit, both in this world and in the world to come. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Okay, so when the quote was that you can drink the beer of idolaters, as long as you take it home and you're not drinking it in a social situation.
Yeah.
So they didn't feel like today, if you had the same context today, people would fear, or people who are scrupulously kosher would fear adulteration. In other words, so there was no fear of people mixing beer with other things, kind of.
Okay, so let's break this down to a few things. One is, first of all, the rabbis acknowledge that wine is different than beer. So now let's stick into the world of wine. Wine, there were some concerns of adulteration, but the main concern was there's a rabbinic text that talks about how if a beer was made by Jews and supervised by Jews, but a Jew, if I was hanging out, if I'm an ancient Jew and I'm hanging out with my ancient non-Jewish friend, and I get a cell phone call, anachronistically, obviously, I go outside to answer it because I have better reception there. If I'm outside long enough for him to bore a hole in the wine cask, pour a little wine out for a libation, seal it back up. If the amount of time I've gone for that, then the whole wine is considered not kosher. And the rabbis invent, and it's a complete invention that even, I once was going to write an article about how it's a complete invention, but then medieval Jewish commentators acknowledge that. so it became not interesting. That the rabbis say that if you boil wine, then it is not suitable for pagan libation, which is a total made up, but it's a nice workaround. But that to today, at catered kosher events, if it makes a difference. If the wine is boiled wine, in mevushal, it can be literally poured by waiters who are Jewish or non-Jewish. But if the wine is not, if it's not boiled wine, it's kosher wine in all other sense. If the wine is open and then anyone but a Jew pours the wine, the entire bottle is no longer kosher. So that actually, and that affects to this day, it affects the production of everything from wine to Welch's grape jelly, and there's a whole fascinating history of Welch's grape juice in America, and Jews, but that's a whole other story. But even like the production of wine and vinegar today goes back to these texts. Is that a long enough answer?
I have one. Do we have any sense of what the production might have looked like? Like, what did Rav Papa's brewing business or brewery look like? Did he have workers, or how was he doing that?
So they don't tell us too much, although some of the only things we know directly about beer production, actually, like there's a famous text in the tractate Abba on Idolatry, where they're talking about the beer that Babylonian non-Jews would make for a wedding, and Rav Papa couldn't get to everything, but Rav Papa pipes in then, and there's no piety or profit motive. It's just a point of information. He says how, gives us a little bit of how they brew that beer. Probably to make wealthy for it, he had to have people working for him to do it, right? So, but we don't know too much about it. We do know that they made it through the most common beer. Beer is, we were talking about this before. Beer is kind of a more flexible term in that sense. Some people only want to say non-wine intoxicants, but I'd say just like today, beer is a pretty wide semantic range. They would make it with, often common with dates, but also barley, and so there are other varieties of beer, darker, lighter. But it depended on the quality of it and the quantity. But probably for someone, and again, we don't know too much about it from, Rav Papa doesn't tell us too much about it, but many people would make a little beer or a little wine for themselves at home, but to make the kind of wealth that Rav Papa is, and many texts talk about his wealth. So it seems that he was known, and by the way, the rabbis are on the whole a pretty wealthy group. So it's like you're at the wealthy country club and they're saying, well, that's the guy who's really rich. And you're like, well, so he owns 5 houses instead of your 3. And that's the feel you get for that. So he clearly had to have employed people, but they don't talk too much about it. So I'm only speculating. We know more about other beer brewing enterprises, but there's no reason to presume that the rabbis were that exceptional in that.
Yeah.
Does that answer that?
Yeah, that makes sense. He's like the Schlitz of Babylonian.
Yeah, well, it's unclear whether it was Schlitz or a higher quality.
Oh, higher quality, yes.
Not that I would disparage Schlitz.
So does this mean, obviously you couldn't hire non-Jews to make wine, but could you hire non-Jews to make beer?
Yes, so you can hire just as in so modern kosher laws often are very different than ancient, but draw on some similarities for it. And what I'd say is in antiquity and in today, there are certain parts of every practice that could be done by a Jew or a non-Jew. But so with wine, there's a lot more jobs that have to be Jewish union jobs. Beer, there's a lot less. Beer you can pretty much have, so like let's say Kate was a rabbinic beer baron. Kate could supervise a whole group of non-Jews doing it pretty easily. Wine, she would have to pay a lot more. There's fewer tasks that could be done by someone who's Jewish or not Jewish. But beer pretty much could be just done by all non-Jewish workers with a single supervisor who's Jewish. Wine, basically anything that involves the grapes in any way is really going to need, the way the rabbis set it up is going to need a Jew involved. But this is also one of the interesting things about beer. All of the rules were set in wine drinking culture. And then the great thing about this text is they acknowledge that none of them apply, right? And I always say to my students, like, this is a great text because it does all the work for me, right? When I say it's not about, because they drink the beer. No one has a problem with drinking the beer. It's just where they drink it. And which shows that their concerns about kosher rules are not just about the food itself, because the beer is not the problem. So, and part of that is the production is not, as long as it was supervised.
Do you think it's because of the timing it takes? Like, to my brief, I don't know much about making wine, but with beer, it goes much more quickly. So the timing of potential.
I think it's because they attach all these concerns to it, but wine is also, wine is a tricky thing because you have a very limited season and it's very easily spoils. So, yes?
Yeah, you mentioned with regard to this text that Rav has some financial interest in setting the bar low for drinking non-Jewish tavern, or beer from a non-Jewish tavern. Does that imply that Rav was selling the beer to non-Jewish taverns?
So, unfortunately, we don't have his tax returns. But what I would say is, and this is one of those things, if I just had this text, so I've known about this text for years. This was in my first book. This was in my dissertation. But I didn't quite know what to do with it, right? And then as I've found more, then suddenly it kind of carries on. So there was nothing rabbinically problematic. There's also nothing rabbinically problematic, by the way, of selling kosher wine to someone who's Jewish or non-Jewish, right? And these, if you know, these rules set up unequal social relations where you can come to my house and I can control other things, but I can't go to your house. Like that sets up, reciprocity gets messed up on that. It messes up power relations, right? There would be, so Rav Papa could sell his beer to that tavern, but the second it's now becomes, he no longer owns that beer, he can only drink it outside of it. But if it was it matters who's, because if it was Rav Papa's brew house, then Jews and non-Jews could drink together there. Yes?
Are there any rules or distinctions to be made with regard to the vessels in which these products were stored in or into which they were poured?
So the distinction of vessels, there's a whole, well, first, we're talking about vessels. First, you have to say there's a whole series of purity and impurity rules about vessels in general, which is incredibly complicated and incredibly boring, so I'll leave that aside. So let's assume that all the vessels are pure. Yes, but I'd have to sort of be a huge stretch to, like, it would be like, well, is it Passover? Is it that it's, but really, honestly, the main concerns would be, well, okay, I'll tell you a purity example where it does matter. So, oftentimes beer would be stored in like kegs, like big casks. And then the question came, what if you found a dead mouse? This is what we all want to talk about, right? A dead mouse in that beer. Is the beer not kosher or not? Or you found bugs in that. And there are two separate answers, by the way. I love it. The dead mouse thing is you taste the beer. And if it tastes mousy, then it's not kosher. Which I love because it's like, you go, hold on, let me see. I don't taste mouse, it's kosher. Right? But if it tastes mousy, it's not kosher. But also, if I've kept kosher my whole life, how do I know what a mouse tastes like? Right? And then with bugs, they say, well, it matters if the bug, and this is also with wine and other things, they would have, like, you see this now with like an absinthe spoon where you would like drain things out. Beer and wine had stuff in it because it wasn't filtered as well as today. And there's a whole set of, can you filter on the Sabbath or not? That's a whole other discussion we can talk about. But they say, well, if there are bugs hanging out in the beer, the question is, what if they're biblically non-kosher bugs? And they say, well, if you look at the Bible, it says if they creep on the land. Say, well, if they've always been hanging out in the beer, they haven't crept on the land. But if you dip in a cup and they touch the cup and then go back into the beer, they've now crept and the cup is the cup. But if they were creeping up and down the cask, that's not land. The cup is the land, the cask is not. But that's them trying to parse. What Halakhah is doing, by the way, what I always try and show my students, this is what all legal systems need to do. Right? You have to, if one person walks up to another and punches them in the face, is that assault? The answer is it depends, right? Is it a sanctioned boxing match where they agreed to, right? Like, so I need to get more facts before I give you an answer. So when it comes to that, it does matter for that, but in terms of just average things, I wouldn't say that that's a major concern for them.
Are there examples of like the practical everyday Jew like following these kinds of things that Rob Papa was saying, like, yeah, let's drink beer right outside the door, or is it kind of just like a philosophical, like, you can do that?
Yeah, so this is a problem we have. The average Yeshua on the street, we don't know much about, because the rabbis, as I said, were this elite subgroup. So to what extent for example, there's a famous early rabbinic text that says you cannot eat in synagogues, but then there's a famous synagogue at Late Antiquity, which is the port city of Rome, which predates the destruction of the Second Temple, where there's a kitchen in it, right? So then you say, well, number one, they're in a synagogue, they're Jews, but are they rabbinic Jews? Or we have one synagogue that has a pagan imagery in it, the Helios, the sun god in the middle of the synagogue. The rabbis hate that, but so first we have to say is, well, how likely was it that the average person listened to the rabbis? And I do think a good example is today, how likely is it the average parishioner in a synagogue, a mosque, a church, likely to follow all the things that their religious leader at? Like, if you were to interview everyone of any, you go to any religious institution in Los Angeles, how likely is it? Now, it'll vary from community to community. So do we know how much people follow this? And also, in these texts, it's not set. So for example, so it's not just that like Rabbi Bonesho and Rabbi Rosenblum are disagreeing. It's, you might be a follower of Rabbi Bonesho, which she might say yes, and I might say no to something. So what do I derive from the fact, if you're doing that, how do I know if you're a follower of Rabbi Bonesho that said yes, or you just don't even know what's going on? Like, how do we know that anyone was reading their blogs? We don't. And that's another example, like how many blogs are out there? How many people have read that? If in 1,000 years you found a blog, right? How do you know if it was a real important YouTuber and influencer, right? Like, how are people in 1,000 years going to understand influencer culture? Like, how are you going to know what was or wasn't, right? They could look at the sneezing panda thing and think, there's so many views of it. It must have completely influenced society. Everyone must have been going around sneezing, right? Like, but it's ridiculous, but also that's somehow we're trying to get to it. So what I would say is it's really hard to know. And what I'm trying to do here is like get to the fact that these are little, I feel like I just get little snippets. So, but I also tend to fall on the side of being pretty minimalistic of, I don't know how much we can get about the average person from that, which I think is also fascinating. Is that okay? Is there another hand? Yeah.
I was wondering if you know of any modern uses or modern attitudes towards using beer to make kiddush, especially like within Orthodox communities.
Yeah. So some communities really want to push it. So if you look at the texts, the Talmud comes pretty hard down on no for kiddush for Friday night, but maybe for Saturday. And then there's some later discussions about it. And basically, like in all things, if you really want to justify it, I can find you ways to justify it. But it's pretty strongly, what some people will do is have, if they're that way, they'll have a little wine for kiddush and then they'll drink beer. It's technically, you can find precedent for it, but really, most will say no, but yeah, there are some, I know several beer-loving Orthodox rabbis who find ways to justify it when they can, but don't necessarily publicize it. That's what I also find interesting. Very few will actually publicize it, because there's a difference between a sort of a private opinion and a public opinion.
My great-grandparents from Wisconsin, so I was just wondering, what was the Jewish life like in Wisconsin at that period, especially in terms of taverns and because most of them were out of Minnesota, but they had stores called Wraps
Yeah.
in Wisconsin. So did they kind of go, because since you're a peddler, you can probably go to the bar.
Well, so it depends on the time. So let's talk a little bit about alcohol in America, because that's what we all want to talk about. Great. So it's interesting. So I briefly mentioned. Let's start with the story of Welch's grape juice. Okay, let's go back even more. Jews, because we know, because of these concerns of wine being made. This is all going to have a point. Because there's concerns about wine being made by wine of idolaters, Jews, from antiquity to modernity, it's a common practice for Jews to make their own wine. Nowadays, there's enough industry and things, but it used to be in Europe, there would be many small Jewish tavern keepers who would make wine for themselves and for the local community. And then when they emigrated to America, that practice continued. In America, particularly in the Northeast, you have a grape that grows well there is the Concord grape, which produces cloyingly sweet wine. If you've ever had any or made the mistake of having too much Manischewitz wine, you understand the problems with overly sweet wine. But Jews grew Concord grapes for other Jews, and so in America, the association between what is kosher wine became overly sweet. And I'm not sponsored by the Manischewitz company, so I can say this, wine that is not to my taste. Then in America, there becomes a temperance movement that's particularly a Christian temperance movement that first tries to embrace Jews as, Jews never get drunk. They never drink alcohol. And then the reality was there are some Jews who get drunk. And by the way, ritually, Jews drink alcohol for all sorts of rituals. And that didn't work. So then they turned to rabid anti-Semitism. But that's the second part of the story that we're actually going to get back to, because that's an important part. But then companies like Welch, which is our Christian temperance family that was looking for a source of grapes to make grape juice and grape jelly that was non-fermented, purposely to be part of this temperance movement, ended up buying Concord grapes from Jews who were producing it. So it is this interesting confluence of this Concord grape becoming a big part of American culture as grape juice is for a reason that connects to this as well. Now, the anti-Semitism part comes back because during Prohibition times, everyone was violating it. And one of the big problems was there was an exception made after first the amendment passed. Then Congress had to make a rule of how to apply that and how to put it into practice. And they then carved out an exception for like a religious leader could make it and only members of their congregation. So if you're Catholic and you want to have the Eucharist, you need to be able to get access to wine. If you're a Jew the fascinating thing is you look at, and the congregants are allowed access to it. If you look at registers of synagogues, starting like 1919, 1920, you have an explosion of what you might consider less than Jewish names, paying dues to synagogues to get access to sacramental wine. In fact, actually, I can quickly, because I have another PowerPoint that I use for, where's this? This is in my food class, if I can find this quickly. This lecture's PowerPoint from like years ago. Where's my Jews and Booze? Someone wrote a book entitled Jews and Booze. Where is this? There's actually a few things that we're going to come to this, where I teach about this. Here. So we'll start here. This is a famous picture. Yep. Kosher wine for sacramental purposes. So this was then people like Henry Ford, a rabid anti-Semite, when you used to buy a Ford, you'd get Protocols of the Elders of Zion in your glove box. To say things, this is what I'm getting to, I have to find is it, was it, yeah, wait. No, right here. The Minneapolis Press one. Every vendor of the vile hooch, every owner of moonshine still in the Twin Cities is a Jew. And then we have tons of these things. And so we're getting back to this. So a big claim became, about Prohibition time, that it's Jews who are violating Prohibition and getting alcohol, when in fact everyone was violating. There were tons, and that's why it was quickly repealed, right? And I mean, it's one of the reasons that Bush becomes such a major distributor. Like, how did it suddenly ramp up distribution so quickly? A lot of companies that did well then were secretly doing it and then just removed the fake sign from the industry thing. It's like, oh, we're just selling paper products, right? Oh, now beer is allowed? Boom, look, oh, we happen to have a beer factory right here. So now we're getting, so Jews then, that was part of the story. But then last point I'll make about Jews at Wisconsin, there's a false image that particularly University of Wisconsin-Madison was this amazingly welcome place to Jews because it never had a quota. So East Coast schools would have quotas, which is correct. And there were lots of Jews who didn't, they're starting in the 20s and 30s, but it did allow housing discrimination. So you could advertise, it never had enough, Wisconsin purposely and to this day doesn't have enough dorms for students because they want to prioritize in-state students and make it harder for out-of-state students, even though I'm sure the economics here too work where you want to charge out-of-state and international students more because you can and it gets complicated. But they still don't have enough. And part of the reason too is now there's a private dorm industry that also wants to make sure, because they built all these private dorms. But there are private dorms that now are almost completely Jewish, still to this day. And the reason of that is because 20s, 30s, 40s, the university would allow, which had no quota, but it would allow any private dorm to advertise, even if it said on their public advertisement, no Jews allowed. So the interesting thing, what you see is a tension between the allowances and a public perception. And if you can't figure it out, these are the things that academically interest me. The conflict between a public perception and a less than complicated undercurrent. And I think that's where you get the interesting things of history. So that's a really long answer, but hopefully helpful.
The other question I had was also about the fact that in a lot of places, beer, because of waters not being considered safe or wet, beer would be like a choice for a safe drink.
100%.
Would that be considered kosher, because you had to drink, or would that?
Well, beer and wine were consumed by babies and adults. And exactly, if you get in your time machine, which depending on your generation is a DeLorean or a hot tub, right? You go back in time. If it's the ancient world, drink beer or wine. Do not drink water, right? But the rabbis, and even like when the microscope was discovered and people suddenly saw what was below that, like they're like, whoa, look at all these bugs and things. But you find medieval intermittent commentators that I mentioned about the beer, bugs were in everything. They understood that. And they also understood that water could, it's basic experimentation. Bob drank the water, Bob died. Maybe we need to do something about the water. But yeah, that's why beer and wine it's just about, wine was watered down. So much more watery than before, or you drink smaller quantities of it, but beer and wine were much safer, and they knew that to drink then.
So was beer more prevalent so that wine would be only used at special occasions, and maybe beer would be...
No, it depends on where you lived. It's like a Coke or Pepsi thing, but like everyone drank wine in wine drinking regions, everyone drank beer. And they just talked about the different quantities and qualities that should be drank for adults, children, gender binaries too, what was appropriate for a woman to drink versus a man according to them. But no, it was not. It was normal for a 5-year-old to drink wine in a wine drinking culture or beer in a beer drinking culture.
Thank you.
Not that I'm advocating, I'm always afraid that someone's going to quote me 5-year-old should be fed beer.
Wonderful. I think that puts us at time, if I'm not mistaken, but please join me in thanking Professor Rosenblum for this wonderful lecture.